some ads for Toshiba or Hitachi or Lotus Software, that kind of thing, in this context. It is a perversion I try to do. These technologies have this image of being high-tech, very sophisticated, very complicated, and not applicable to development situation. This perversion of discourse I will try to do today, try to emphasize the opposite. I will do that in 5. That's the example of this. We have here exactly what I want to say today. That is, this technology can be used for people. It's interesting that in this case, it's always white people. And it's always white people and children also. So perhaps the perversion I will try to do today, to think about this image of the child as the child of development, something that we will think a different way. What I will try to do exactly is think about what the Labour Office, the International Labour Office, called the blending of new and traditional technologies. The blending between the new technologies of the information technology and the traditional knowledge of the people. Not these people, but even it could be these people. So I will try to do this in 5 points, beginning with the basic understanding of technology transfer that we have since a long time. That is the diffusion theory. I will try to show that going further, we need some new tools that I will call the convergent model of communication, according to Everett Rogers, Dr. Rogers, and the constructivist paradigm that I will explore with you. Then I will put the emphasis on the indigenous knowledge system, the central point of this course, of this talk. I will try then to see how the computer, and especially the microcomputer, it has to be clear that my interest is microcomputer and not computers in general. And I will try to make a point on the difference between microcomputers and the whole computers. And for that, I will use some examples of microcomputers for development. And I will especially use the case of some expert systems used for development by anthropologists at the beginning. Some of you perhaps will be a bit disappointed that I don't do an evaluation of the uses of microcomputers for development. This evaluation is very difficult to do, mainly because of the lack of data. What I will try to do today for you is giving you a framework to consider this problem. That is basically the way I thought about it. We can go now to the first point. That is, I will try to show the importance of the diffusion theory for development as a starting point of my talk. The history of the extension function, that is perhaps the first way we think about this development problem, was from the beginning to replicate the US model of extension. It has been written a lot about this. The US model, the famous land grant system, was implemented in third world countries after the Second World War, even if sometime it has been made before. I was thinking, for example, the case of Venezuela, where before the Second World War already there was some introduction of the American model by copying the institution, the American institution there in Venezuela. What I tried to show with this slide is the image, the symbol of the mirror image. That's what we try to do there. It's also, by the way, an ad for a microelectronics company. That's interesting. That's also another trend I will try to give a few words about today. It's the use of arts in all these things. I will make a point about this. Well, what I want to say by this way is the mirror image also has been qualified for this application of the US model of slavish copy. This idea of slavish copy, and I take this word from a report from Everett Rogers and two other scholars in '76, explained that the replication of the US model overseas neglected the situation of this country and the situation of the extension services. I will try today to show that this is according to me the most striking point of this history. It is fidelity to the diffusion tradition in its first version, in its earlier version, its most linear version. Now the diffusion tradition itself evolved, and I will use two evolutions of this tradition in terms of research. That is the concept of reinvention and the concept of decentralized model. Reinvention, this is also an ad for, not for a microelectronic company, but for one possible application of microelectronics, that is geographic information systems, and in this case, images of satellites. I really love this slogan because it gives exactly the idea of reinvention. Not two businesses see the same thing alike. Not two people see the same innovation alike. People reinvent innovation. People adapt innovation to their own needs. And a lot of studies of innovation demonstrated since the 70s that innovation can't be considered as a given that won't evolve during its diffusion or implementation. People adapt all the time these things. This acknowledgement of the reinvention feature of diffusion helps us to understand that we have to consider innovation during the implementation, and went through a different way of seeing innovation after the acknowledgement of invention. The second concept I will think about today, we talk about, is the decentralized system of diffusion. And it's again an ad for a microelectronic company called Motorola, is more than microelectronics. And again, they give the slogan, new ideas are everywhere. There's not a centralization of the people who create, invent, and then you diffuse. The centralized model of diffusion was the first model from the very beginning. It was considered as the linear model of diffusion. It evolved when we understood that new ideas are everywhere. I don't want to go on further on this diffusion tradition because I guess that most of you are familiar to it. I just wanted to emphasize these 2 points, reinvention and decentralized model, as the starting point of a new way to consider innovation. This new way helps us creating new tools to consider innovation from this starting point. And I will consider two ways to do more than this early version of diffusion. One being the convergence model, and the other being the constructivist program. So we'll now can go to the second point. The emergence of these new tools for communication has been facilitated and has been synchronous of an important stage in the way we considered information during the 70s, both from a scholarly point of view and from a practical point of view, a professional point of view. This important step, has been qualified again by Everett Rogers in '76 in an article as the passing of the dominant paradigm of development. During the 70s mainly, the concept of development has been redefined in kind of challenging way, perhaps we could say that the concept of development has been reinvented by the practitioners of the field at this time. According to several lines, first, the participatory process of social change, that is, make the people part of this development. And it has been also reinvented or redefined in its objective. Before this time, it was thought that development was mainly economical development. That is, the measure of this was gross national product per inhabitant, or some refined way to think about this. At this time, scholars began to introduce different ways to think about it, and especially social advancement. People began to measure development in terms of number of medical doctors for 1,000 inhabitants, access to literacy, and something that was kind of forgotten before. That also been considered for the majority of people, something that was politically clear at this time. The environment itself was introduced in this discourse at this time also. If we go back, look back again. Well, they say this also at this time. New ideas are everywhere. All they need is the environment to make them happen. That's also another way to consider this. We can go back. So, the first new tool, I say new tool, it has been developed in 1981 by Everett Rogers and Lawrence Kincaid. The new model of communication, that is the convergence model. Communication at this time has been considered as a process toward mutual understanding between people, and that's the big move, not as something linear from somebody emitting a message to somebody that will passively receive this message. This mutual understanding is a slow process and iterative process, but is never completely achieved. And that's also something important. That means that if you communicate with people, there will be always a part of the belief or the attitude of these people that you will never understand. That means also that this part of these people is their identity that you will never touch. And you have to respect that, and you have to consider that as something that belongs to them. And this was perhaps the very beginning of the idea that top-down strategy was completely impossible because of this. Now I will go to a tool that is I'm much more familiar. That's what I call the constructivist paradigm. I will introduce it by a metaphor. This constructivist program was also a movement in art in the early 20th century in Russia. It has been developed after that in quite different version as the Bauhaus movement in Germany. I use it one piece of art of the constructivist movement in Russia, who says that it is a piece of art about the pacifiers. What is interesting, and that's why I showed it, is telling that it's speaking about the indigenous pacifiers. The slogans say, better pacifiers that have never been nor ever will be. And the representation of the pacifier itself is very constructivist. Now, more seriously, even if this was very serious at this time, the constructivist problem in sociology has been well expressed by Steve Woolgar. And perhaps the best expression is his expression that appeared in an article just a few months ago. The constructivist problem is coming from sociology of science. It is an European approach at the beginning, even if now it's some American scholars use it. It began really with a very tough criticism of diffusion tradition. Actually, it took just the postulate of diffusion tradition and inversed it. I will express it here in 6 points. I gave the scientific, that is the sociology of science, expression of the paradigm between parentheses. What interests me today is the technological expression of the paradigm, something quite new, as the constructivist program is going now to technological analysis, something it wasn't intended to do at the beginning. So you have these 6 lines. I won't read everything. I guess everybody can read it, or everybody has access to it. So the most important thing is the expression social construction. From the idea of reinvention, you can't read it?
No, if you push that one a little bit farther out, then it becomes much louder and makes your voice
Record more too.
Yeah, we can't do it. I can't move a bit. I can move a bit like that. That's what I can do. At this time, the most important expression was social construction. It has been also known as the paradigm of social construction of technology, after one important book in 1987 from three different kind of approaches, European and American approaches. The idea is that from the concept of reinvention, that would be the bridge with the diffusion tradition, the people reinvent or socially negotiate the innovation during its invention and its implementation. What it means is that all the people involved in a way or another in the innovation are always negotiating the future and sometimes even the past of this innovation. The way that the school I'm coming from in France is considering this process is called the translation school. Translation being more than only translated the way you translate two languages as a basic understanding of the idea of translation, but also the way that you move interest and social definition of the actors negotiating. That is, during the course of the negotiation of technology, what the actors really negotiate at the same time is their own identity. Coming from the convergence model, that means also this mutual understanding. The way they negotiate this identity in the translation analysis is considered as the way they put themselves as representative of somebody or something. I will especially consider one point today is that the constructivist analysis of artificial intelligence. This is also a kind of provocative picture. It's coming from Scientific American. It's about some expert system, so artificial intelligence, using architecture. That made me laugh a lot when I see this picture because the example they choose is a hypothetical museum of constructivist art. I think it's not casual, I don't think. It can't be casual. So several constructivist scholars had studied the artificial intelligence controversy. There's one main controversy in artificial intelligence. It's about what they call the computing nature of the brain. There's this idea that is very well known for everybody, I guess, that these people thought that the brain can be considered as a computer, or a computer as a brain, that there was a direct connection between both of them in terms of theoretical way of thinking about it. Well, because of these two versions of the artificial intelligence controversy, one being the strong version and the other the weak version. The strong version says that computers are brain and brains are computers. The weak version say we just have to create expert systems that mimic human behavior. This mimic has one goal, one purpose, the performance of the expert system. Now the constructivist analysis of this artificial intelligence controversy showed that these two criteria, mechanism, that is the image between the brain and the computer, and performance, are not problematically distinct. That you can't call to performance without thinking to process the mechanism. And mechanism itself in a way to see performance. We will see that this is quite an important result from my point of view to understand the way we can use indigenous knowledge in development. So now we consider the third point, that is indigenous knowledge itself. Extension from the very beginning has been sometimes considered as the way to give confidence to the local people in the modern technology, the way they have confidence in their traditions. Some people say that. It's not exactly the way the school of the movement of indigenous knowledge system consider this. Say the idea of the indigenous knowledge system is to use the knowledge of the people for development purposes. I consider this also to be very close from the idea of blending traditional and modern technologies. Well, I'm sorry about this picture. My point here is that this blending sometimes is problematic at the level of rationality. Very often it has become a debate, an important debate for indigenous knowledge scholars. Should we consider the rationality of these systems in terms of the rationality of the new technologies? Very often people say no, but this way they had to define this rationality in another way than from the modern technologies. And sometimes they say that it was practical, that the indigenous knowledge was defined by its practical purpose. It was used in practical situations. Some people, however, like Oakes in this book published in 1980 by Mike Warren and some others, demonstrated that this thing is just using an acceptable dichotomy for another unacceptable dichotomy. Using the practical way to understand indigenous knowledge just finally legitimize the utilitarian paradigm, that is the new technology paradigm. Some practice, and I chose this picture to illustrate this, can't be seen this way. Even if it's a very good image of blending, it's in New Delhi. This is the capital of India. And suddenly there are all these cows in the middle of the street. Well, some people can say this is real blending. You can see the image. Well, now if we think about the rationality of this, it's difficult to put this in modern terms. It's difficult to consider these cows as a good illustration of the utilitarian paradigm. As you see, a lot of religiously grounded practices, for example, the target of a lot of accusation from the people from the modern part of the debate. My point here also is that it's difficult to define the rationality of indigenous knowledge, perhaps because it's difficult to define what is indigenous.
Jerry, at least the cows are all driving on the correct side of the road.
Yeah, that's blending. That's blending. When I prepared this lecture, I tried to find, that was very naive on my part, I tried to find the definition of indigenous. I had some hard time. I didn't find one. I found something like 15 or perhaps more. Each time somebody was giving a definition, there was somebody else that was giving a counter definition of what is indigenous. I finally arrived at a point where I was thinking that everybody on earth is indigenous from a certain point of view. I will take for illustration of these two definitions of indigenous people. One being from the World Council of Indigenous People, that is perhaps the right side of the way to consider the problem. As you see, the definition is quite long. It refers to land, It refers to social traditions. It refers to language. It refers finally to a lot of features of these people. Now if we go to the other definition, which is the International Labour Organization, you'll see a quite different way to define these people. I especially like in this definition the less advanced stage, because I think it's very clear that these people from the International Labour Organization, they define indigenous people with negative criteria, and it's very often the case. We can hear that they are illiterate, that they are acculturated, that they are dominated, that they are spoiled. A lot of words like that, very interesting to define somebody who is indigenous. Well, if you consider yourself, like I do, as indigenous from the little part of France where I'm coming, I don't like that kind of definition at all. Now, if you look at the other definition, it's so vague, in fact, that, well, I like it, but it doesn't inform you a lot about what I am, I guess, or who everybody else could be. So finally, I took the easy way to define these people, and that was the last criteria used by the guy giving this definition. By the way, there was a report in '87 from a guy called Julian Berger. It was called Report from the Frontier. That was the state of indigenous people in the world at this time. And the last criteria he used finally was to say, why not accepting as indigenous the people who revendicate these status? People who say, I am indigenous. And why are you indigenous? Because I am indigenous. I don't have to explain you why I am indigenous. Would you want me to put my words in your discourse? More or less that's what he says. I have the feeling that's the good way to define this. And it also goes against all this temptation of imperialism, of cultural imperialism, that are define somebody else from your point of view. These people, in this definition, are acting in an imperialist way. And if I say something else, then speaking of my own case of indigenous from this little part of France, speaking about you or you or you, then I will be imperialist again, like everybody. What it means to me is that these indigenous people are often defined in the process of a confrontation between two systems of knowledge, modern or indigenous. Defining them by the negative can't be a good way to achieve the mutual understanding I was thinking about. Now I'd like to see how microcomputers can help doing that. That's perhaps the most provocative question. I'm thinking here in this fourth point about an article published by a Sorbos called Bella Mori, who was dealing with what she called first world technology in third world context. That's a good way to introduce my problem about microcomputers. Microcomputers are clearly a developed technology. I was wondering when I prepared this lecture, I was thinking about the question, where are the microcomputers, or where are the computers? Actually, I don't have an answer. I just have a beginning of an answer with some data published by the UNESCO in '85, what they call automatic data processing equipment. I have to confess that I don't know exactly what it means. I hope and I guess that the computers are part of this definition, but it's also a problem with these institutions. Sometimes they define things also, even when it's concrete artifacts like computers, in a way that you're not sure that what they mean is really computers. Well, they mean computers in this case. What it shows is that what they call others export just 1.7 of this equipment. Now, if you took the other pictures, who import import of automatic data processing equipment. 10% of this equipment are going to other part of the world, as they say. By the way, Asia, don't think that it's a lot of developing countries. Asia is, in this case, Japan, Singapore, Korea, and Hong Kong. So this 10% really represents more or less all the developing world. With just one problem in my data, that some countries were not in this data. I didn't see Brazil in this data. I didn't see Taiwan in this data. Well, Taiwan is not recognized by the UNESCO. I didn't see India either. I didn't see China. So even the data itself represents the problem. But I guess that after that we can say that computers are a developed technique or technology. I will go even a bit further to say that computers define our technological culture in the developed world. And for this I will use the work of two communication scholars. One is James Carey and the second is David Bolter. David Bolter in '84 wrote a book called Turing's Man, and the subtitle was Western Culture in the Computer Age. He and James Carey showed how computers changed the way we consider our technological culture. You can go to another art expression of this, to show how computers can invade all part of our life. We have now fractal art. I don't know if a lot of you are familiar with this. I was not very familiar. At the moment I was preparing this lecture, I was reading an art review and suddenly again I saw the word computer. Say, God, I want to be able to do something else than preparing this lecture. It seems that it's very difficult to avoid computer for whatever part of our culture now. What Bolter said about that is that computers are defining our culture, that computers are creating a special link between this technology and the way we consider our own culture. And it's working at the metaphorical level or at the practical level every day for whatever activity. You are here in the States in contact with computers all the time for a lot of daily activities. I would choose another expression of that to demonstrate how computers invade our cultural life. This is it's not very clear, I'm sorry about this, but I guess it's very important. It's computer-generated pictures of the AIDS infestation. You have in little in blue the HIV virus, and in white, the big white thing is the lymphocyte. So computers are going to every hot topic of our society now and define it in a different way, visualize it, give pictures of it. Usually these studies of the impact of computers for our cultural technology, culture of technology, we're working the way the diffusion studies were made. That is, people thought about computers and thought about the effect of computers, the impact of computers. And it says, for example, that computers are a threat to invade every aspect of our life, the way I tried to demonstrate here. I have a point here, I guess an important point to make, is that this image of this technology invading our life has been defined as control and common technology. It's a famous way to define computers. I want to make the point that this applies more to mainframe computers than to microcomputers. And I show you, it's not very focused, but I show you an ad for one of the first company making microcomputers. It was called the People Computer Company. It was in '72 in Palo Alto, in the San Francisco Bay. It's to show that the ideology of the guys who invented this device were not exactly mainframe, were not exactly military origin. One of the first characters even had a big symbol of peace. These guys were all hippies, they were all social activists, they were reacting against mainframe computers when they created these first microcomputers. So when you see an analysis of computers in general, you can think that there is a problem. Computers are not one artifact, they're different kind of computers. The microcomputers can't be considered the way mainframe computers are. This, for me, comes to the point that we can't define technology in itself, and that's perhaps the best result of the constructivist paradigm that I will try to apply to this. What we have to define is the social or the human interaction with the technology. And this depends on the ideology embedded in the technology by the people who invented this technology. They create a special way to interact with the technology. In this case, I guess that the microcomputer ideology was not exactly a control and common technology. We are working on that on the project now. It's just beginning, but our point is that the evolution and the different reinvention of the microcomputer technology lead to what we know now. Also by a second kind of level perversion that was the business type perversion of this ideology of microcomputer. That makes that sometimes this microcomputer look like mainframe computer. I'm sorry about that. In this case, what I mean is that, you can put it to the next slide, what we need to define is not the technology in itself, but its interaction with human beings. And it's very often regarded as the concept of computer literacy. I choose an example here is the Lotus. This is an Egyptian review journal, an Egyptian journal of the software application. It is, I guess, more than a translation of an ad for Lotus in the States. There are symbols in their way to present this that are going further than only the translation of the same ad. What I mean here is that this computer literacy problem is more than the translation of what we consider most of the time as the computer literacy. Very often computer literacy has been defined here in the States as the way people can manage the technology, the competence of people to use microcomputers inside this context, here in the States, or there in Europe, or there in Japan. Now, some people, and I'm thinking about a scholar called Papagiannis, who was working for the Canadian a few years ago, explained that in the case of third world countries, developing countries, what we need is to define the way microcomputers can help, can contribute to development. This is more than the performance of the people with the computers. And this, perhaps, is more linked to our point today. I have another slide about this. Well, it's not very clear either. There was also a problem of translation. I guess you don't have it there. Yeah, it's inverse. Yeah, you can go to the next slide. My point here is that that's another example of how computers can invade everything. Even drinking at work.
Nothing sacred.
Yeah, and I choose this slide to show that, and also to make the transition with my next point, because absolute intelligence is also artificial intelligence. And I will try to see now how artificial intelligence can help linking indigenous knowledge and development. You can go to that. That's, perhaps some of you will think, at least finally we'll do that. I'm supposed to talk about this since the beginning. Yeah, the problem is that we don't have a lot of application of that kind of things. I will refer here to a set of anthropological works using artificial intelligence, that is mainly expert systems, for modeling development, indigenous knowledge, and put this in relation with development. There are different names of this anthropological work. Some people call it ethnographic decision tree. Some people call it expert system application to anthropology. Perhaps the most general way to refer to that is what they call cognitive anthropology. I see my colleague with a big smile. Basically, I think that all these different approaches can be considered the same way, under the same basic way of thinking, that is modeling the insider's world through the insider's world, through the insider's eyes, and I would add, and the microcomputer. And something is, this last point is perhaps forgotten sometime. I will take an example for that. I will take the example of a folk expert system that has been developed in Peru. It's a classification of soils. I have a picture to show that. It's a picture in the Andes. I'm not sure it's in Peru. It's the relationship between the classification of soil and irrigation. It has been studied by two scholars, Serge Guillet, I think he's American, but I pronounce his name, it's a French name, and Luana Furby, and I refer to their publication. This example is especially interesting for me because of three different kind of reasons. First, and it's next slide, is that this folk system was the first step, but the three other boxes of this chart, of a global management model, field management there in the Andes. So we see that the whole model begins with this folk expert system. That's interesting for me because this development example, trying to model the global way people manage their fields. The second good reason to me is that this folk expert system was modeled from the knowledge of 10 farmers. And usually expert systems are made from one expert, from the knowledge of one expert. I was a bit disappointed that I couldn't read in their article the way that this 10-person knowledge was defined, if there was social interaction between them in the way they define this for the expert system, I couldn't see that. But it's interesting because it seems to me as the first step toward a model of social knowledge, more than one expert. And the third point, and that's also very close to our problem today, is that this folk system was made also to be compared with the Western soil classification. And this is interesting because it's exactly this communication problem I'm thinking about. That's this confrontation of a Western classification and a folk system. Now, I will also consider what they give as the reason to study this folk system. There were many good reasons to study this folk system. I will here quote Luana Furby because I guess that's a very good way to explain how and why they studied these things. She said in one of her articles that one of the most important findings in the previous work before the model was that more soil is created in the Colca terraces, that is in this place, in this special folk technology, than is lost each year. So what she said is that they studied this special example mainly because it was successful. That is, more soil is created than lost. And she even goes further, saying that yields are high, and you can show them. This is an example. This is in Colombia. It's not in Peru. But this is an example of that kind of ecosystem of the terrace problem. She said this kind of way to manage this field is very successful. Yields are high on these slopes. And she said, and that's the next slide, she said when they don't do this, then you have this. You have erosion, you have terrible cloud. I took this picture, it's not the same, it's just an illustration. So what I want to say here is that to explain why they studied this fault system, basically what she said is that it is a successful system. Said this way, it seems okay. My point is that it's not that okay. That there's a problem in this way of explaining why we should study indigenous knowledge and how we should study it. To demonstrate that, I will use another explanation of that kind of studies, and this time it's by Serge Guillet. He refers here to something more interesting for me as a sociologist of science, is that why from a disciplinary perspective they studied this knowledge system. And I quote him, he said, "Interested in cognitive science has also helped to reinvigorate a cognitive anthropology weakened by criticism of the failure of ethnoscience elected taxonomies to specify the means through which data are selected." What he says that we should study, and they do study that kind of systems, basically because they have to, from a disciplinary perspective, that their discipline has been weakened by the fact that they can't explain how these systems are working. And that's a completely different way to explain why and how we should study expert systems. That's why we should study indigenous knowledge. I will, to make this point clear, I will go back to the point I made with the constructivist study of Steve Woolgar of artificial intelligence. If you consider, like he demonstrated, that performance and mechanism can't be separated, if you refer only to performance, then you won't see the problem of mechanism. That is, if you go only to the problem of why these systems are performant, then perhaps you won't study some systems that are not performant in this state at this moment that could be performant. What I mean here is that this study demonstrated that what we should consider is a cognitive interest in this system. We should go to the understanding of this system, and we shouldn't go to the understanding of the performance of these systems. And this will lead to my conclusion now. That's from the very beginning of this lecture. You can go to the next slide. I consider the paradigm shift